Russians are set for another 6 years of Vladimir Putin's rule following an election widely described as a sham. Putin faced no meaningful opposition in the vote. The three hand-picked opponents on the ballot did not campaign. In his victory speech, Putin said he would now focus on Ukraine following 2 years of a war against Russia's neighbor that was expected to last only a few days.
Marching out to meet supporters, Vladimir Putin celebrated an entirely predictable election win after securing yet another term as Russia's president. He claimed the victory was due to the trust and hope Russians had placed in him.
First of all, I want to thank the citizens of Russia. We are all one team. All the citizens that came to polling stations and voted. Once again, I want to say, and this is very important, the source of authority in the nation is the Russian people.
Voters had little choice. All those who could have meaningfully challenged Putin are either jailed, exiled, or dead. Russia's leading opposition figure, Alexey Navalny, died suddenly last month in an Arctic prison. Breaking his silence over Navalny's death, Putin called it an unfortunate incident. The elections have been criticized as being neither free nor fair by the US, Germany, and Ukraine.
The Russian dictator is simulating another election. Everyone in the world understands that this figure, as has often happened in history, has simply become addicted to power and is doing everything he can to rule forever. There is no evil he won't commit to prolong his personal power.
The election win appears to have emboldened Putin's plans for his war in Ukraine. In his victory speech, he vowed to strengthen Russia's military. Putin has now been in power since 1999. If he completes his next 6-year term, he'll be Russia's longest-serving leader in more than 200 years.
Now, ever since Russian authorities closed down DW's bureau in Moscow, our bureau chief there, Juri Rescheto, has been reporting from Riga, Latvia, and he joins us now for more. So, Putin has extended his rule for another 6 years. Juri, tell us more about reactions to the Russian leader's re-election.
Well, Terry, apart from the congratulations on Putin's victory in the Russian state-controlled media, many people in Russia reacted as they have been reacting for almost 25 years now, namely, not at all. How should one react of something or to something that was to be expected from the beginning? Putin himself held a press conference, you mentioned it, and as expected, he spoke about the consolidation of the Russian people. He said that all goals would be achieved. He didn't talk about war, but it was clear to everyone that what the most important goal was. Putin's three unsuccessful competitors also congratulated him. As for the reaction in the Western countries, neither the USA nor the EU spoke of a fair and free election. Their argument was that there is no real opposition in Russia. German President Steinmeier will not congratulate Putin, according to his spokesperson.
So in his victory speech, Juri, what kind of vision has Putin laid out for Russia?
Well, I think Putin's vision of Russia or for Russia in the coming years is best explained by one example. Putin appeared in his election staff and thanked his election workers. He said he thanked his comrades in arms and explained the meaning of the word comrade in arms, or соратник in Russian. In this word, he said, there is an old Russian word ratnik, and this is in turn means a fighter, a simple man from a village who volunteers to go to war to defend his fatherland. Putin said that history is repeating itself and that all Russians are now соратники, or comrades in arms. He didn't explicitly talk about war, but of course he meant war. Conclusion is Putin's Russia of the next few years, of course, is not only, but above all, a country at war.
Well, Putin surprised many, Yuri, by actually mentioning in his press conference there the name of Alexey Navalny, the opposition figure who recently died in prison. What do you make of that, Yuri?
Well, I think it's bizarre that Putin never used Navalny's name when Navalny was alive. And now that Navalny has died, he has mentioned his name several times. He said two important things. Firstly, he said that Navalny had died, which was, of course, sad, but that's life, he said. That was Putin's indirect response to the accusation that Navalny had been killed. And secondly, Putin said that he was prepared to exchange him for a prisoner from another country. And this statement by the Kremlin leader caused absolute outrage among Navalny's colleagues. They called it a lie. Regardless of how you assess Putin's words, it was a signal to the West that Russia was ready for another prisoner exchange.
Yuri, thank you so much. That was DW's Juri Rescheto in Riga, Latvia. There is little doubt, of course, about who would win Russia's presidential election, but those opposed to Vladimir Putin heeded a call by the Russian opposition movement to flood polling stations at noon on Sunday and signal their discontent. Thousands also turned out to protest the election at Russian embassies around the world.
Lines stretch into the distance outside Russia's embassies. In England, Turkey, Kazakhstan. All have come to cast their vote for Russia's next president. But for many, it's an act of protest.
I didn't come to vote for anyone. I came to vote against everyone.
Thousands turned out in response to a call from the Russian opposition movement to line up at midday on the last day of Russia's tightly controlled presidential election. The Noon Against Putin rallies were championed by Yulia Navalnaya, the wife of Kremlin critic Alexey Navalny, who died under suspicious circumstances last month. Navalnaya joined over 2,000 Russians lining up outside their country's embassy in Berlin. 6 hours later, she cast her vote for president.
Of course, I wrote Navalny's surname because it just can't be so that a month before the election and during the presidential campaign, Putin's main opponent, already imprisoned, was murdered.
With all of Vladimir Putin's major rivals in prison, exiled or dead, the outcome of this election was never in doubt. But even in Russia, thousands still turned out at noon on the final day of voting, showing each other and the world that there are still many who oppose Putin's rule.
It's now been 10 years since Russia illegally annexed Crimea following an invasion using troops without Russian uniforms. It was the beginning of a decade-long war with Ukraine, culminating in the full-scale invasion 2 years ago. Its position on the Black Sea makes Crimea a strategically important asset. The peninsula serves as a key base for naval fleets and is used to safeguard security interests in the region. Crimea is home to both ethnic Russians and Ukrainians, as well as indigenous Crimean Tatars and others. Russia's annexation tactics there are being used to claim other territories in Ukraine. For more, I'm joined now by Alexey Yusupov from the Friedrich-Ebert-Foundation think tank here in Berlin. Alexey, give us a sense of what life is like now in occupied Crimea. And do people there today identify mainly as Russian or Ukrainian?
The answer depends very much on who you ask. Life can be very different in Crimea. I mean, what is true is that there has been a massive infrastructural effort by the Russian government to transform Crimea into a riviera of hotels and tourism industry, but also to refurbish the industries that have been there. And there has been a promise to the Crimeans that their standard of living will rise, the pensions will get higher, and so on. Some of these things happened, but at the same time, there was a lot of repression going on. The promise of a multilingual peninsula with Ukrainian and Tatarian both still being taught in schools is not upheld. And there is a lot of redistribution of wealth. So if you are a businessman on Crimea, chances are that your property is already or will be taken away, because there is a major reshuffling of power structures on the peninsula after the annexation. So it depends very much on who you ask.
Now, Vladimir Putin has extended his rule yet again. The election gives the impression, at least, that the Russian people overwhelmingly support his policies. What should we expect from Putin now that he has secured another term?
I think the most important learning about this election is the very high turnout. And we know that the presidential administration in Moscow was very focused on securing a high turnout because it signals a momentum of national unity around Vladimir Putin. And it seems as if this was important to actually start a new chapter of his rule, of his government. I mean, now he can stay in power for at least 6 more years. And obviously, he is set to do something with this time. The campaign itself was very domestic and economic policy oriented, but it's clear, and he said it himself, the special military operation, so the war on Ukraine, will remain the priority. So we'll probably see a continued and an escalated effort to subjugate Ukraine on the front.
Does Putin face any real threats to his power at this point, or does he have every reason to feel emboldened after this election?
Well, yes and no. The regime is perfectly capable of keeping the things in control on one side. On the other side, all the things that have happened in Russia domestically were surprises. If you think about the mutiny of Yevgeny Prigozhin, if you think about the very unexpected success of the only anti-war candidate, Boris Nadezhdin, you think about the lines of people who came to honor Alexei Navalny, if you think about this action that you just reported on yesterday at noon. So things are happening outside of the grasp of Kremlin. Kremlin gets and becomes more and more autocratic, but it loses also the capacity to forecast. So on the one hand, in terms of brutal power, the Kremlin is on the height of its development as an autocracy. On the other hand, I don't think they have a lot of capacity to know what's coming tomorrow or the day after tomorrow.
Now, the West is deeply concerned about Vladimir Putin's expansionist policies. How effective would you say Western efforts are to contain Putin's ambitions?
I think so far we've been, and the Western governments have acted quite reactively and tactically. And maybe it's time to understand that we need a strategy for maybe 7 to 10 years. This will be the time frame in which Moscow itself will be planning the next steps. So it is about containment, but it's also about ramping up its own credibility, the West's own credibility about being serious in terms of support for Ukraine, in terms of rearmament, but also in terms of follow through in economic sanctions and other instruments. It's time for strategy now.
Alexey, thank you very much for your insights. That was Alexey Yusupov from the Friedrich-Ebert-Foundation.